Keir Starmer confronted in Glasgow by angry pro-Palestine protesters. Keir Starmer got absolutely mobbed by furious pro-Palestine protesters in Glasgow last night and ended up looking so visibly shaken, his security had to physically push activists away, while 2 people got arrested and the whole thing descended into chaos, with protesters screaming "child murderer" as his Range Rover tried to escape. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, and today we're unpacking the confrontation that left the Prime Minister rattled, why his position on Gaza has generated this level of fury, and whether a leader who can't walk through a British city without being surrounded by protesters accusing him of facilitating genocide has any credibility left on foreign policy. I'm bringing you multiple videos today because watching Starmer's carefully managed public image collapse under the weight of angry activists is both dramatic and revealing about the political consequences of his Israel-Palestine stance. So let's dive into exactly what happened in Glasgow, why protesters are this angry, and whether Starmer's position on calling for humanitarian pauses rather than ceasefire is politically sustainable when it generates this level of public fury. Alright, so the scene in Glasgow was properly chaotic and needs to be described in detail because it shows just how intense the backlash against Starmer has become. He was walking through the city when pro-Palestine protesters swarmed him, not just shouting from a distance, actually coming in close enough that his security detail had to physically intervene to push activists away. That's not normal political heckling. That's a security situation, or the Prime Minister's protection officers are having to create physical barriers between him and protesters. The accusations being hurled at him were absolutely savage. As he arrived at Glasgow station, protesters were shouting that he's facilitating Israel's genocide in Gaza, that he's responsible for killing babies, demanding he stop the massacre of over 7,000 babies. Others were calling him a war criminal, saying he should be in prison, asking why he voted for continued genocide. When he got into his Range Rover to leave, activists surrounded the vehicle, shouting "child murderer." That's not protest, that's sustained personal accusation of the gravest crimes imaginable. Earlier on his train to Glasgow, another protester had confronted him, filming the encounter and asking how many more children in Palestine have to die before he calls for a ceasefire. The man cited the figure of over 7,000 children slaughtered by Israel, questioning where Starmer's humanity is, asking what happened to human rights and democracy. Security escorted the protester out of Starmer's carriage, but he kept shouting questions about how many more people have to die. It's relentless pressure from multiple angles throughout his journey. 2 activists were arrested for assaulting police officers, which shows how heated the protest became. When you're escalating to the point of physically attacking police, that's moved beyond peaceful protest into something much more volatile and dangerous. Police Scotland had officers at multiple locations dealing with ongoing protests, managing crowds, making arrests. This wasn't a handful of people with signs. This was significant enough to require substantial police response. The context of why protesters are this angry matters because it explains the intensity. Starmer has supported the government's position calling for humanitarian pauses, rather than demanding a full ceasefire. To his critics, that's a meaningless distinction that allows Israel to continue military operations with brief interruptions, rather than actually stopping the killing. Humanitarian pauses sound compassionate, but if bombing resumes after the pause, the practical impact on Palestinian casualties is minimal. He whipped his MPs last month to vote against an SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire, instead demanding they support Labour's amendment for pauses. 10 frontbench members resigned over this issue, choosing to break party discipline and vote with the SNP. That's a significant rebellion that shows even within Labour, there's fury about his position. When your own shadow ministers are resigning rather than supporting your stance, that signals deep problems. Starmer's argument that calling for a ceasefire would embolden Hamas is the standard line from those supporting Israel's military response. The logic is that Hamas would use any ceasefire to rearm and regroup, so maintaining military pressure is necessary. But to protesters and critics, that argument sounds like justifying unlimited civilian casualties in pursuit of military objectives. When thousands of children are dead, the emboldened Hamas line rings hollow to people prioritizing humanitarian concerns over strategic calculations. The death toll figures protesters cite, over 7,000 children, are genuinely horrific if accurate. Those aren't combatants, they're kids. Whether you think Israel's military response is justified or not, that level of child casualties generates visceral emotional response. Protesters see Starmer as complicit by not demanding a ceasefire, by supporting a position that allows operations to continue, by prioritizing strategic considerations over stopping the killing of children. What's particularly damaging for Starmer politically is this isn't fringe extremist protesting. This is substantial segments of labor's base, Muslim communities, young progressives, human rights activists, all groups that traditionally support labor. They're not conservative voters he can dismiss. They're people who should be his supporters but are so angry about Gaza they're confronting him in train carriages and surrounding his car screaming abuse. That's coalition fracture in real time. The visual of protesters surrounding his Range Rover shouting child murderer is politically devastating, regardless of whether you agree with their characterization. Leaders need to be able to move through their own country without being mobbed by furious activists. When you can't, it shows you've lost significant portions of the public so completely they view you as criminal rather than leader. That's not sustainable politically. The fact this is happening in Glasgow is significant because Scotland has substantial pro-Palestine sentiment and Labour needs Scottish seats. If visiting Glasgow means getting mobbed by protesters, how does he campaign there? How does Labour win back Scottish seats from SNP when significant portions of the electorate are this angry on foreign policy? The electoral implications are serious beyond just the immediate embarrassment. Starmer's position on Israel-Palestine has been awkward from the start because he's trying to balance multiple pressures. Supporting Israel's right to defend itself, which is the official Western position and important for U.S. and broader international relationships, not alienating Jewish voters and community who might view criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, managing Muslim and Arab communities who want strong pro-Palestine advocacy, keeping his party together when MPs have wildly different views. It's an impossible balancing act, and he's failing at it. The humanitarian pauses versus ceasefire distinction is the kind of technocratic language that sounds reasonable in Westminster but infuriates people watching children die. To protesters, it's sophistry that allows killing to continue while pretending to care about humanitarian concerns. They want the killing stopped, full stop, and pauses that allow resumption don't achieve that. The refusal to call for a ceasefire reads as prioritizing Israel's military objectives over Palestinian lives. The 10 frontbench resignations show the political costs within his own party. These aren't backbenchers he can ignore. They're people who held shadow ministerial positions, who had careers invested in labor leadership, who resigned on principle because they couldn't support his position. That's serious dissent that weakens his authority and emboldens further rebellion. If shadow ministers are willing to sacrifice positions over this issue, it shows how deeply people feel about it. The accusations of war criminality and calls for prison are extreme but politically devastating. Genocide is the gravest possible accusation, implying intentional destruction of a people. Whether Israel's actions constitute genocide is hotly debated among international law experts, but protesters have made that determination, and they're holding Starmer accountable for what they see as complicity. Whether it's accurate or not, being publicly accused of facilitating genocide is catastrophic for any leader's moral authority. The question about how many children have to die before calling for a ceasefire is emotionally powerful because it has no good answer. Any number sounds heartless. Starmer can't say 7,000 isn't enough without sounding monstrous. He can't say, okay, ceasefire now without contradicting his stated position. He can't explain strategic calculations without sounding like he's prioritizing geopolitics over children's lives. It's an impossible question designed to expose the moral bankruptcy of his position as protesters see. The visual of security having to push protesters away and surround his vehicle shows loss of control. Leaders project authority partly through ability to move freely and engage with the public. When you can't guarantee security can safely move leaders, it constrains their ability to engage with public, campaign, fulfill duties. The more this happens, the more security will insist on controlled environments and limited public exposure, which creates further disconnect between leaders and the people they represent. What this entire episode reveals is Starmer's vulnerability on issues where his technocratic approach conflicts with moral urgency people feel. He wants to be measured and strategic, maintaining relationships and considering all angles. Protesters want moral clarity and immediate action to stop the killing. Those approaches are fundamentally incompatible, and Starmer's discovering that triangulation doesn't work when people are demanding you take a clear ethical stand. The comparison to other controversial foreign policy moments is instructive. Iraq war protests were massive, but Blair maintained his position. Vietnam protests in the US were sustained and eventually contributed to policy changes. The question is whether Gaza protests reach critical mass that forces political response, or whether leaders weather them by maintaining their positions. Starmer's betting on the latter, but protests show no signs of diminishing. The fact this is happening now, months into the conflict, shows sustained anger rather than brief outrage. People aren't moving on, they're becoming more entrenched in opposition to his position. Every new casualty report reinforces their fury. Every refusal to call for a ceasefire strengthens their conviction that he's complicit. That's a dynamic that could continue indefinitely unless something changes. If you've made it through this breakdown of political confrontation and moral fury, hit that like button because understanding why leaders face this level of public anger